And now, a Channel 2 News special presentation, Decision 2014, an extension of Alaska's political pipeline. Tonight's debate, the senatorial candidates for the Republican primary.
Hello and welcome to Decision 2014. Tonight, Channel 2 News presents a debate between the three main candidates vying for the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate. Next Tuesday, Alaska voters will choose one of these men to represent the Republican Party in the November general election. We hope what you see and hear tonight during our program will help you make a more informed decision on Election Day. Time now to meet the candidates. First up, Joe Miller. Mr. Miller lives in Fairbanks with his wife and 8 children. He is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, Yale Law School, and has a master's degree from the University of Alaska. Mr. Miller is in the legal profession, serving as an attorney and as a former judge. Next is Dan Sullivan. He and his wife and 3 kids live in Anchorage. Mr. Sullivan is a graduate of Harvard. He served as the Attorney General for the state of Alaska and is the former Commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources. He currently is in the Marine Corps Reserves. And our third candidate, Mr. Meade Treadwell. Mr. Treadwell lives in Anchorage, where he and his late wife Carol have 3 children. He is a Harvard and a Yale grad. Mr. Treadwell is the former chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission and currently serves the state as the lieutenant governor. The Ivy League is well represented here tonight. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us.
Good evening.
Our format for this debate is pretty straightforward. I'll be asking the questions. Some of those questions have been submitted by our colleagues over at the Alaska Journal of Commerce. There will also be an opportunity during the debate for you to ask questions of your opponents. We'll give each of you 60 seconds to answer a question. We have a timekeeper to count you down, and at the end of your time, you will hear this. That's the little sound, and we'll ask you to stop there. So we want to start by talking about Alaska's relationship with the federal government. And Mr. Miller, you're going to get the first chance to answer this. The feds have a huge presence here in Alaska, of course. It owns about 60% of the land here in Alaska. We've all heard about the three-legged stool as well that portrays the main sectors of Alaska's economy. The Institute of Social and Economic Research says that along with oil production and resource development, the federal government is one of the legs supporting our economy. In recent years, Alaska has received about $10 billion annually from the federal government per capita. We are near the top of the list of states receiving federal money. Despite these important ties, Alaska seems to have an antagonistic and contentious relationship with the federal government, and when we don't get our way, state leaders tend to call it federal overreach. Must there be such an adversarial relationship with the federal government, or might we make more progress with a different type of approach? Mr. Miller, I'll give you 60 seconds to answer that, please.
Steve, I don't think there has to be an adversarial relationship, but there needs to be a different relationship. One of the things I predicted a few years back is that federal funding to this state would go down, that earmarks would go away no matter what happened, and in fact that has happened in spades. Fairbanks, Alaska, for example, we've gone from hundreds of millions of dollars in Corps of Engineer contracts down to tens of millions, and that's creating real pressures on the people in Fairbanks. The different approach that we need to take is not putting our political pressure on the easy money, because it's not so easy anymore. In fact, we're at 200 trillion unfunded liabilities, about 17.5 in absolute debt. And the end result of that is that no matter what happens, no matter where that political pressure is applied, that money is going to decrease. Our delegation, both our senators sit on appropriations. The debate now is not where to spend, but it's where to cut. So a state that's so dependent like Alaska is, has to seize the opportunity that's presenting itself with people like Senator Cruz and Senator Lee that are seizing the opportunity to rearrange the relationship according to the Constitution, where states take a leading role. They look to their resource base so that we can build hope and opportunity and jobs for our kids and grandkids.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Sullivan, your turn now. 60 seconds.
You know, it doesn't need to be that way, Steve. What we need is a federal government that is a partner with us in opportunity, not an obstacle. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that we have a federal government that is an obstacle. And this issue of federal overreach is a very, very real one. And as long as we have that, and think about it, it's whether it's the EPA or the Department of Interior. You know, we had the EPA drawing guns on placer miners in Alaska. The federal government is out of control here. And what we need to do is get to a place where we continue to fight that federal overreach. And as Attorney General, DNR Commissioner, I did that. Mark Begich has been a rubber stamp for this overreach. But we would much rather have a federal government that's a partner in opportunity, not limiting our opportunities, helping us with them. And as a U.S. Senator, that's what I'll do. I'll focus on For example, one of the things I've called on is a moratorium on federal regulations. That's the kind of thing we need to do to create opportunity here, not have a federal government that's about obstacles.
Okay, Mr. Sullivan, thank you. Mr. Treadwell, your turn, please.
Thanks, Steve, and good evening. In my 40 years in Alaska, I've had a chance to work with our statehood founders, and they worked to get that 49th star on the flag to bring power and decision-making home, and that's why I want to go to the United States Senate. I'm not interested in going to Washington with a gunny sack to bring home lots of money as much as I am interested in going to Washington with a crowbar to pry loose our liberties and to bring power and decision-making back to the state. One of the things that I've made a bold proposal on is on federal land. Federal land is right now 2/3 owned by the federal government, and they are not doing the job of both protecting the environment and making jobs happen. And we're seeing this in the Outer Continental Shelf. We've seen this with President Obama cutting the National Petroleum Reserve in half. We have to take away their power to meddle so much in our state. And many states are working together now to bring land home. It's happened in Canada, and I believe we can do it here.
Mr. Treadwell, thank you. Let's move on to another question. The three of you are vying to be part of a group that right now is not very popular in the eyes of the public. The latest Gallup poll shows Congress has a 13% approval rating, while 83% of those polled disapprove of the job that Congress is doing right now. That same poll shows that to fix the problems in the House and Senate, a good portion of folks want to see more bipartisan cooperation. In other words, more compromising. If elected to the Senate, will you be willing to compromise with the other party, or is that a dirty word? Mr. Sullivan, can you start us off, please?
Well, you know, I think when you talk about the polling with regard to the Congress, it's because of what I call the Barack Obama, Harry Reid, Mark Begich agenda. It's trillions of dollars of debt on our kids' backs. It's federal agencies out of control. It's resource development that's shut down and delayed here. But if Congress is starting to do things for Alaskans, you can start to see that change. I think one of the ways we can change that is beat Mark Begich, get rid of Harry Reid as Senate Majority Leader, and we can start getting things done for Alaska and the country. But in terms of getting things done, I have principles, less government, more freedom, that I will bring to the Congress. But my whole career has been about getting things done. And that means working with all different groups. I had a lot of success as Attorney General, DNR Commissioner, on overhauling our permitting and regulatory system. Very bipartisan effort. A lot of success working on the Choose Respect campaign. Very bipartisan effort to bring down the levels of domestic violence and sexual assault in Alaska. And I will do that if it's going to be good things for the state and the country.
Mr. Sullivan, thank you very much. Mr. Treadwell?
Well, thank you. I want to see our federal government do what the Constitution says it's supposed to do, which means that spending bills need to move from the House to the Senate, and we need to get a budget, and we need to get a budget in time, and not have these games of chicken that shut down the government. I will work across the aisle to make sure that we do what needs to be done. But I will tell you this, we've got to go back to fundamentals. I have told Alaskans, and I make this pledge here again tonight, I will not vote for a debt extension of the United States unless we also have a vote on a balanced budget constitutional amendment. The debt extension is going to come up on the floor of the House, the Senate probably next March. And it's about time that we began to spend within parameters and balanced budget. The U.S. government buys maybe 50 million lunches a day. It could be MREs in the desert. It could be Meals on Wheels here in Anchorage. The real problem is we're putting too much on our credit card. And if we can't get the parties together on that, we're not going to have a country.
Okay, Mr. Treadwell, thank you very much. Mr. Miller, question to you, please.
You know, Steve, Senator Cruz, I think, put it best when he said it took a whole lot of compromise to get us to $17.5 trillion in debt. Now, I'm absolutely willing to work across the aisle where we have agreement on the liberty agenda. I think that's key. But I don't think anybody should fool themselves about where this country is at right now. We have a President Obama that has a socialist agenda, and that agenda is to take liberty. It's to expand federal power. It's basically to prop up a federal government and say it has all the answers. And the people on his side of the aisle, they want to continue to move that agenda forward. And what's happened with the Republican Party, for 30 of the last 34 years, Republicans have gone along and got along. And what have we had as a result? An increase for 30 of those 34 years where Republicans have controlled the House, the Senate, and or the presidency of the federal government. Infringement on liberty. What we have to do is we've got to stand up to this president. That's why I've called for his impeachment. I believe that should happen. It's why I've challenged both of the folk on this stage to join in that call. But we do need to join with those on the left where we have agreement. The NDAA, The surveillance state, there are major issues of agreement where we can move the agenda forward, and on that I'll work hand in hand with those on the other side.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. We're going to take a break right now, but before we head to break, if we were going to look into your iPod, Mr. Sullivan, what music would be playing right now?
U2 Joshua Tree. I went running to that this morning.
Sounds good. Mr. Treadwell?
Hobo Jim, I did the Iditarod Trip.
Oh, it sounds good. Mr. Miller?
Skillet, it's a Christian contemporary group. I won't back down.
All right, sounds really good. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with more Decision 2014 right after this. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, go ahead, talk to me. Oh, okay, we'll do that. We'll do that. Okay. Sounds really good. Thanks, buddy.
Welcome back to Decision 2014, a debate between the senatorial candidates for the Republican primary.
Welcome back to Decision 2014, our Republican debate. I want to continue with the questioning. We're going to lead off with you, Mr. Treadwell. Last year, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky introduced a bill entitled the Life at Conception Act. He says it would extend legal protection to the unborn from the point of conception forward. In other words, if approved, it would ban abortion in this country. If elected and that bill comes to the floor of the Senate, would you support it?
I would certainly support moving forward with the debate. And I do believe life begins at conception. My wife and I lost a son at 9.5 weeks, and for the life of me, and as I think about Jack every day, I cannot say that he wasn't a person the day before he was born. We knew him in the womb. We had named him. And I think we have to fight this major civil rights battle of our time, which is the people in the womb are people. And we have to look at that. Now, people look at this as taking rights away from women. I don't. I look at it as standing up for an innocent person. And Mother Teresa said the person in the womb is the poorest of the poor. So I'm glad that Rand Paul has brought this forward. I think it's important that we have this national debate again and still. And I have stood up as Lieutenant Governor. I've stood up as a citizen based on my own personal conviction to stand up for life where I can, including parental notification. There may be many other pieces of legislation that could help reduce the number of abortions in this country, but I think it's important to have the debate about personhood.
Thanks, Mr. Treadwell. Mr. Miller, question to you, please.
Steve, unequivocally, yes. I've read the bill, unlike both of my opponents in the last debate where this came up. The Life at Conception Act is important. It establishes something that I think is foundational. If we as a country decide that we aren't going to defend the most defenseless, if we decide that the most defenseless, their lives can be taken, what other rights can government take? And my statement to those that join my liberty cause but disagree on this issue, to them, my argument is, think about what government can do to all those other fundamental liberties that you hold dear. A government that does not protect those that can't defend themselves will not protect the other rights. I'm the only endorsed candidate by Alaska Right to Life in this race, and there's a reason, because this has to be an unequivocal stand, one in which people don't back down, because life is such an important issue. And it's not just this issue of fundamental rights, it's also an issue of where our country is at today. 56 million dead has real economic consequences to this country, but more importantly, it's tearing apart the moral fabric of the nation. And so no matter where you're at on this issue, I plead with you, this is something all of us that love the liberty agenda ought to get behind. It's something that we ought to support, and that's why I'd support and vote for Rand Paul's bill.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Sullivan, question to you, please.
You know, Steve, I'm also a strong pro-life candidate. I believe in the sanctity of life. As a father with 3 teenage daughters, I know that there's certainly no greater gift and responsibility than being a parent. And I think that one of the things that we need to look at in terms of not only legislation, but the way in which government interacts with our citizens is to make abortions, the number of abortions less in this country. And, you know, I have looked at the statute since we discussed it in the last debate here. And, you know, I think it's an important look at trying to make abortions less numerous in this country. We need to bring that number down. There are issues, though, that I saw with the statute where it looks like it's a statute trying to change the Constitution. I'm not sure that's the most viable approach with regard to this issue. But I will tell you, we also need to change hearts as much as laws. And I think that one positive thing that's starting to happen, you're seeing that. The younger generation, the polls show that Americans are becoming much more pro-life, and I think that's positive.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Immigration, of course, has been a hot topic of discussion in this campaign. If elected to the Senate, you may be dealing with proposed immigration reform legislation. According to estimates, there are at least 11 million immigrants living in this country illegally. Some of our leaders, including former Republican President George W. Bush, have proposed that those folks should be granted amnesty. What needs to be done about illegal immigration to this country? And Mr. Miller, you can start us off, please.
Steve, we've seen this as a big issue from the very beginning of this campaign. We've adopted a 7-point plan. We put that out in a press release earlier. I think the most important thing that we can do if we're compassionate about this issue is we take away the inducements that are causing people to come here. And certainly by granting amnesty, the end result, whether you call it amnesty or pathway to citizenship, the end result of that is you will attract more to this country. And that's one of the reasons why I took a pledge to both of my opponents in this primary and asked them to sign a simple pledge against amnesty. They both rejected that. I also asked them to sign a simple pledge against birthright citizenship and taxpayer inducements for illegals to come into this country. They've rejected that. What we have in this country is a situation that's by our own making, and in many cases, by the president's making. He's opened the borders. He's told ICE agents to release people that are known criminals because they meet his criteria of just simply saying, I was here before I was 16. When we have a system that encourages this, it threatens all of us. It threatens the very values we hold dear. I mean, think about it. Pew Study research says that 53% of illegal aliens identify with the Democratic Party, a party that does not hold the Second Amendment as a fundamental right, as many of us here on the stage apparently do.
Mr. Miller, thank you very much. Dan Sullivan, your turn.
You know, Steve, obviously the issue is a big issue right now. There's a crisis on the border, and I think it's sad when you see what's going on with these young children, but the best approach to dealing with them is to reunite them with their families in their countries. And it's also important to recognize we are certainly a nation of immigrants. Immigrants bring us power. Most Americans come from somewhere else. But we're also a nation of laws. And I think one of the things that we need to focus on is securing our border. You know, we always talk about this, but every other country does this. And we need to focus a lot more efforts and resources on securing our border. I also think that we need to enforce the laws. You know, with regard to amnesty, part of the crisis that we've seen has been an indication from this administration that they're not going to enforce the laws, which has driven people to come here. We need to be very clear. This administration needs to be clear on enforcing laws. We need to have things like E-Verify, which makes sure workers do not hire undocumented citizens to keep down the number of the attraction. And then finally, we need to protect American workers, get this economy moving again.
Okay, Mr. Sullivan, thank you. And Mr. Treadwell.
As a constitutional conservative, I do want us to follow the Constitution. I do want us to follow the laws. And I'm actually quite upset with the racist mailer that Joe sent out on this issue. And I'm going to make it very clear to Alaskans right now. I oppose amnesty. I oppose amnesty, and I believe we need to have borders that are secure. Absolutely no problem with that part. Joe, you wanted to tell us that there should be no taxpayer-funded benefits, and I'm going to tell you right now, as a humanitarian, if somebody is bleeding in the streets and they need to go to the emergency room across the street, we should help them with that. But the idea of lots and lots of federal programs paying for people who are here illegally makes no sense to me. And Dan mentioned the kids coming across the border. Congress wasted our time, wasted our money this summer by arguing about whether or not to build shelters rather than just changing that loophole that has these kids here in the first place, and they should be sending those kids home to be with their parents.
Steve, I need to interject here. I mean, there was direct broadside on racism, and I want to make it clear. I have a Mexican national who's a son-in-law. I have a brother-in-law who's Indian, a brother-in-law who's Indonesian. My wife is a first-generation natural-born American, mother from Austria, father from England. But when people take up the arguments of the left, as Mr. Treadwell has done, it reflects their past history. It's where they've been in the argument. This is not a racism issue. This is about tearing apart the fabric of this nation by saying that we're going to allow illegals to come in, become voters, and change the very way that we do business in this country. Lawful immigration, great. We're a nation of diversity. But unlawful immigration, no. And people dying in the streets, that doesn't result when you take away taxpayer-paid benefits. That's something that's provided by hospitals, by private agencies. People aren't going to be left that way. They're going to go home because no longer are we paying housing, welfare, and other benefits. And that is the most compassionate thing we can do about this crisis.
Okay, I'll let you make a statement. I'm going to have to go back to Mr.
You bet.
Treadwell just in
Well, Joe, I
here.
think most Alaskans thought that mailer was uncalled for. It somehow tried to link the immigration issue and the Second Amendment issue. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, but basically, this is 11 million different stories. And you can't just with the back of your hand say that these people will never, ever get citizenship. I want them to pay their penalties, get in line. I know many people have waited years for green cards. We have to solve this problem. There are people, there are families that do want to get together. You mentioned a member of your family who wants to get together. But you are using demagoguery on this issue in this campaign, and I resent it. I know a lot of Alaskans resent it. We will stay tough on enforcing law, enforcing the borders, but the way you're trying to differentiate yourself from the other candidates does not do you or your party credit.
Meade, the truth is hard.
Mr. Sullivan, do you want to get a final word in here yet? Are you okay?
I just think that the vast majority of Americans agree with some fundamental elements to this, and Alaskans. And the key one here is we need to secure our borders. We've been talking about this for decades. Other countries do it. We certainly have the resources and capacity to do it. It takes will, and that's what I would bring to the U.S. Senate on this.
Okay. Going to switch things up a little bit, and this question comes from our partners at the Alaska Journal of Commerce. Violence is raging in Iraq, where Islamic militants are attacking villages throughout the country, as well as in Syria, as we all know. President Obama ordered airstrikes against the insurgents. Should the U.S. do anything else to restore order in Iraq, or should Iraqis deal with this crisis on their own? And I believe we're going to go to Dan Sullivan. Dan, you get the first word on this, sir.
Well, you know, Steve, I've made a statement that I'd be for troops, U.S. troops, to protect American citizens and diplomats. And, you know, just look at what happened in Benghazi when we didn't focus on doing that. But I think what you're seeing in Iraq is a broader issue of a failed policy from this administration with no clear sense of not only Middle East strategy, but promoting our own American interest around the world. You know, weakness is provocative, and we are showing weakness everywhere, and we're starting to see a very, very dangerous world. You know, last year at this time, I was a Marine, Lieutenant Colonel in Afghanistan, working on counterinsurgency issues. I'm currently serving as a commanding officer of a Marine Anglico unit. I served as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State on a lot of terrorist finance issues under President Bush and Condoleezza Rice. The world is certainly a dangerous place. These issues are not going to go away, but as your U.S. Senator, I'll be ready on day one to tackle some of these big problems.
Okay, Mr. Sullivan, thank you very much. Mr. Treadwell, what to do about Iraq?
Well, first and foremost, let's look at some of the problems that we left behind. We should have had a basing agreement. We should have had a long-term commitment to a stable democracy there that we weren't able to put together in the Bush administration, as a matter of fact. And then we have this situation now where ISIS has come across the border, and that is because of a vacuum of leadership. We do have some soldiers there. The last count I heard was about 900 working to protect our diplomats. And it's very important that we help have a stable Iraqi government. It's disturbing to me that a lot of the problems are happening in the northern part of the country that had always been the most stable. And so it's important that we work together with our allies there. But I'm going to also say this about Vladimir Putin. The Russians owe the world some responsibility here. And they have helped this as a proxy war, and it's about time that we got them into the game to work with us.
Okay. Mr. Treadwell, thank you. Mr. Miller, question to you, sir.
Well, we're in this catastrophic situation because of one word, Obama. We right now have a situation in the Middle East where Obama has destabilized, starting in Libya, then to Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. by his inaction, by weakening this country. There's actually a little bit more of a genesis of this, though, too, and that's the neocons who've decided to embroil us in wars without good results. I'm a Desert Storm combat veteran, and that war got in, got out. We achieved basically the objective, the alliance that we had with the Kuwaitis and the Saudis, removed Iraq from areas that they had taken. That has to be the same approach that we take in battle and warfare today. The type of mission creep, the missions that we have today. My son's a second-year cadet at West Point. He hopes to serve in a combat unit here in about 2.5, 3 years. We need to make sure that we don't needlessly sacrifice his life and others for things that really don't achieve national interest. Now, with respect to things that are national interest, I think the slaughter of the Christians in the Middle East is a huge issue. And where we identify a terrorist element that's a threat to our national interest, get congressional authorization, get in, strike hard, get out.
Mr. Miller, thank you very much. We're going to take a break here, but before we go, tell me quickly, what Alaskan inspires you the most, past or present? Mr. Miller?
You know, I think that Sarah Palin is a major inspiration to the state. She's a fighter. She's gone out there as a reformer. Despite, what other people have said, she's gone out there and fought, and I really respect that about her. I think she's doing great things now in what she's doing.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Sullivan, who inspires you?
Ted Stevens. He served his country in World War II, came here, served Alaska, and but he was a fighter, and everybody knew it, and that's what we need back in Washington. That's what we don't have in Mark Begich.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Treadwell?
I had the chance to work with Wally Hickel for about 30 years. He actually appointed Ted Stevens to the Senate, and I will tell you that he considered his most important accomplishment getting us the 100 million acres of lands that includes Prudhoe Bay. And on his deathbed, he said we should have asked for more. And part of the reason why I'm very interested in serving in the United States Senate is joining with other states and getting our power and bringing land home. And, he was buried standing up, facing Washington, so he didn't have to get up to fight. And I'm running to support the dream of our statehooders who really believe that we could make our decisions here, not in Washington.
Okay, Mr. Treadwell, thank you very much. Gentlemen, thanks. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with more of Decision 2014 right after.
Welcome.
Stay with us. Welcome back to Decision 2014. We are holding a debate between the three main Republican candidates in the GOP primary, Joe Miller, Dan Sullivan, and me, Treadwell. We've got a chance now for the candidates to ask one another questions. And Mr. Miller, you're the first one up. You get a chance to ask a question of Dan Sullivan.
Now, Dan, I like you, so I'll try to be gentle with you on this.
Oh,
Not to say I don't like
appreciate
me, but,
I appreciate that, Joe. Thank you.
You've done a lot of advertising on how much you like the Second Amendment, and I've seen you shoot guns on your ads. I like that. I got some big guns myself, really big guns, bigger than the Marines have, by the way. But there was
Not sure
recently,
about that. But
well, I think so. M1A1 tanks.
You're right.
Gun Owners of
Although
America, Gun Owners of America
Yes.
chose to endorse me in this
Yes.
race, as did National Association of Gun Rights. And I don't know whether you saw the mailer yesterday from the National Association of Gun Rights, but they've actually described you as a gun control advocate.
Yeah.
What say you?
I'm not. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. I'm certainly not in favor of any new laws with regard to, we have enough laws with regard to our Second Amendment, and I've been a supporter of defending the Second Amendment before the U.S. Supreme Court. So I had the opportunity with a bunch of attorneys general, we've talked about this before, Joe, to lead Alaska's efforts in the Chicago versus McDonald case, which is probably one of the most important Second Amendment cases in U.S. history, having the Second Amendment apply to individual Americans. And that's what I'm going to be doing as a U.S. Senator. The other thing I'm going to be doing, which Mark Begich has not been doing, is I'm going to be focused on judges, because that's the critical issue right now with the Second Amendment, who respect the Second Amendment. Right now, Chicago versus McDonald won by 5-4. Already certain people are talking about revisiting that case. And I'll make sure as a U.S. Senator that we're not going to have judges or justices on the Supreme Court who are against our Second Amendment rights.
Mr. Miller, you get 60 seconds to review.
Now, of course, Dan, you also had attorney generals that actually worked against Stand Your Ground. We know that. That's a point of fact. They testified against Stand Your Ground before the state legislature. In addition to that, as we discussed at an earlier forum, we've actually done a Freedom of Information request to find out exactly what correspondence there was between your office and Representative Newman's about how you actually fought to pass Stand Your Ground. We found nothing, zilch, zero. In fact, the Department of Law came back, said they're non-existent records. But I think what the National Association of Gun Rights is getting at least in their email, was the Lautenberg gun ban. And that's where if a woman slaps an abusive husband, by a preponderance of evidence, if a judge comes in and says, hey, you can't do that, she could lose her gun rights forever. In other words, not have the ability to actually defend herself. And on that NAGR survey, you actually refused to stand up to that and say, hey, I'd work to repeal it. And I think that's their concern. It's my concern too, because I don't believe that gun rights ought to be taken away just on spurious lower court decisions that don't actually have anything to do with the reality. It's a fundamental right. I think people ought to be protected. There's no question about that. But we're talking about a fundamental right that's designed to challenge tyrannical government.
Okay, Mr. Miller, thank you. Mr. Sullivan, you have a question now for Mr. Treadwell.
Yes, I do.
I'm ready.
So Meade, as you know, one of the things I've been focused on in the campaign is honoring the commitment to our veterans. And on Veterans Day, my campaign announced what we called the Promises Delivered Project to address the crisis. This was Veterans Day last year, the crisis that we saw with regard to the Veterans Administration. What specifically would you do to help reform the VA and better serve our veterans?
Well, first off, Dan, thanks for that. Thank you for your service. And I just want people to know that I'm the son of a veteran. After my dad died, I was raised by a veteran of the Korean War and a veteran of the Second World War. One had the frostbite and the other had the shrapnel in his back to prove it. And part of my conviction that we've got to help fix the VA is based on watching these two gentlemen die of cancer. And they had to drive hundreds of miles past major medical centers in Western Michigan in order to get help. And I believe it's very important that we continue our effort to bring VA help to veterans where they live. And that's been something that's been a bipartisan approach. It's very important. The second thing is I'm disgusted, as I know you are, Dan, with the issue of people getting bonuses and for faking the waiting lists. I've checked, worked with us on the waiting lists here, but I want to see Congress investigate, and I want to see the capability of the new VA head to be able to remove people who have been misbehaving.
Mr. Treadwell, thank you. Mr. Sullivan?
You know, Mead, I appreciate those comments. With 77,000 veterans here in Alaska, we have the highest per capita number of any state. And one of the things I've watched with Senator Begich is, even though he's on Veterans Affairs Committee, he's been asleep at the switch. You know, one of my Marines, when I was training in December with my Marine Corps Reserve Unit, asked me about this budget deal that was going to eviscerate retirements for current serving veterans, even guys who are disabled. This gunnery sergeant of mine mentioned up to $100,000. Sure. We need to, and Mark Begich voted for that in December. We need to make sure our senator is vigilant, not only on the VA issues, and I'm proud to say that our Promises Delivered project had ideas in there that we put out in November that have now become, many of them have become, or some of them have become law in this latest move by Congress, which I think is a good start. But we need a senator who's vigilant, feels passionately about making sure they're going to take care of our veterans, and that's going to be my focus, one of my critical areas of focus if I'm a U.S. Senator from Alaska, unlike what Mark Begich has done.
Thanks, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Treadwell, you have a question now from Mr. Miller.
I'm going to ask Jill the question, but I will say both. I thought that was a sleazeball move by the Democrats, what they did with the budget on veterans, and a sleazeball move by Mark Begich not to support the Republican attempts to fix that part of the budget. Joe, real simple. Last year, over 60 ships passed through the Arctic Ocean, through the Bering Strait, carrying mostly hydrocarbon cargoes to Asia. And we have a coastline which is essentially unprotected. There's no oil spill prevention capability for these ships, and yet people who live there hunt, fish. It's very important. So my question, what should we do to protect our coastline from these new oil shipments? How do we protect food security in our fishermen in Western Alaska? And what should the U.S. be doing, and what should Alaska be doing to make sure that we play a major role in this brand new economy of Arctic shipping?
Well, I've only got 60 seconds. I'm not sure I can answer all that, but let me start with Arctic is critical. I think you and I both agree on that. We see not just in the resource base a need to develop that area, need to do it responsibly. Obviously, a whole lot of people in the Arctic depend upon that region, things being done right. There is no doubt, Admiral Mullen said this a few years ago when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, there's no greater threat to our national security than the national debt. And the reason why is because we aren't able to do those things that we need to do in the Arctic. For example, get more icebreakers, ensure that we have a greater Coast Guard presence to protect our coastlines, to protect those in our interest in the Arctic. That's critically important. But as long as we continue to go along, get along, and expand the federal government in all of these other areas, the end result is that our military, our Coast Guard, is not going to get its fair share and is not going to be able to do what it needs to do to protect our interests. Now, in the Arctic, you and I have a significant disagreement. You've been a lifelong proponent of the Law of the Sea Treaty. You believe that's the pathway for the Arctic. I believe the pathway to the Arctic is bilateral agreements with those nations that have Arctic regions within their coastline, not having an international agreement that imposes sovereignty, United Nations sovereignty, over the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Treadwell, 60 seconds.
Well, thank you. And I've spent more than 60 seconds on this issue. I've spent most of my 40 years here in Alaska helping us be ready for a changing Arctic. I was chair of the Arctic Research Commission, and I've worked very hard on icebreakers. Actually, getting icebreakers for Western Alaskans had one major impediment when Ted Stevens was around. He told me it was Senator Jim DeMint who did not believe that we should have icebreakers. It was a senator who supported you last time, and that was a problem. At the end of the Bush administration, it was a fellow named Rob Portman, who's a big supporter of Mr. Sullivan's, who again would not let us get icebreakers in the federal budget. And it's very, very important that with as much coastline as we have, an open Arctic Ocean, that the Coast Guard has the capability. And I went down for dinner after our debate last night, met with the Coast Guard Commandant, and he agrees with us. We need to have that 365, 24-hour-a-day capability. I will say this on Law of the Sea. Alaskans fought for many provisions in the Law of the Sea, and for you to dismiss it out of hand and to question our patriotism for trying to move forward protections for Alaska, I think is disgusting. Okay. And I expect you to learn more about what Alaskans need in Western Alaska.
Mr. Treadwell, thank you very much. We're going to have to take another break, but before we go, Mr. Treadwell, hopefully you get to take a vacation after the campaign, after the election. Where's your favorite Alaska vacation spot? Where would you want to go?
Oh my gosh, well, I know where I'm going to go, which is Kachemak Bay.
Okay, sounds good. Mr. Miller, how about you?
You know, the last time I went there, I ended up shooting a Kodiak bear at point blank range, but we love Afognak Island, the deer, the elk, and all the other opportunities of fishing that you have there.
Sounds good. Mr. Sullivan, how about you?
My family's fish camp on the Yukon River.
Sounds good. All right, we'll be back with more of Decision 2014 right after this. Time now for another round of questions from the candidates. Mr. Sullivan, you get a chance to ask the first question of Mr. Miller.
So, Joe, a lot of excitement in the field of energy that we've talked about before. Nationally, the U.S. becoming once again the world's largest producer of oil and gas. It raises a lot of federal issues, and there's one that Congress and the administration have been dealing with right now. How and to what extent should the federal government allow the exports of domestically produced oil and domestically produced natural gas from America and Alaska? So what's your view on that, and how would you lead on that as a U.S. Senator?
Export away. They'll drive the price up. We absolutely need to do it on both sides of it. The energy security of the country comes from production. If we ended up with a major catastrophe where we're at war with a major competitor and we were exporting a significant part of our oil and gas, we could stop that. We could stop it overnight, and we could turn that production for our own resource base. Part of the concern, at least originally in limiting exports, was for that purpose, national security. But it's where the production is at that provides the security, not just the national security, but also the security for our jobs, the opportunity that I think in Alaska we could create for our kids and grandkids. Mm-hmm. You look at what is going on down in North Dakota. The Wall Street Journal this week, front page article said that Alaska is exporting jobs to North Dakota. I mean, that's just upside down. We shouldn't be doing that. We have a state with more hydrocarbons than probably any other state in the nation, maybe all the states in the nation combined. Who knows? Because we haven't even explored the state to the extent that we could. But the key is to make sure that we create an environment in this state to ensure production occurs so that the jobs occur and we can produce so that this country has a secure future.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Sullivan?
One of the things that my campaign has been focused on from the beginning is this whole idea of an American energy renaissance that Alaska should be leading. And we're starting to see a turnaround here in our great state, which I think is very exciting. You know, Steve, a couple of years ago, you and I did a segment on Cook Inlet, and was that going to turn around? It's turning around. It's awesome. And the North Slope is starting to do that, Point Thompson. The gas line progress, you see that in terms of exports, the companies put forward an export license, which is very, very exciting. But I think Alaska needs to be leading this. We can be, but we need a federal government that's helping us. And again, this is where Mark Begich is failing Alaska. We need to have a federal government that is a partner in opportunity. This will help Alaska. This will help the country seize this energy renaissance opportunity. And even, and Joe, you hinted at, it helps our foreign policy and national security. Can you imagine if we're energy independent and not having to import gas from the Middle East? Huge, huge opportunities for Alaska and America, and we need to seize them.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Treadwell, you have a question for Mr. Sullivan.
Yeah, and Dan, let me just say thank you for your work on the gas pipeline and so forth. And I wanted to tell you on this issue of oil export and gas export, I've been working that issue for many years and helped get the first oil export approvals out of Cook Inlet, helped get the gas export approvals off the North Slope, and actually as Lieutenant Governor have worked to make sure that we can had the capability to continue in Cook Inlet. My question for you has to do about something else, and it has to do with some mailers Alaskans have gotten this campaign. And I just want to talk about perception. Is this my watch here? Why did you need to paste my head on somebody else's body when you're going to mail these things? And now I know that you've gotten $300,000 more from your parents to do more of these mailers. To one of the packs, they'd put in close to $100,000 before. What do Alaskans have to expect in the next 4 or 5 days in terms of deceptions? And maybe a second question, you've presented yourself as an outdoorsman. When did you catch your first legal king in Alaska?
Mr. Sullivan, 60 seconds.
Or a salmon?
Me, look, you're mentioning negative campaigning. I think with regard to where you've been in this campaign, I think you've been kind of working the negative campaign since before I even got into this race, right? You've been, remember the jar of mayonnaise comment? Heck, I was still the DNR commissioner on that. And I'll tell you one of the biggest disappointments of this race, and it's not coming from Joe Miller. I've been the subject of close to $5 million of personal attack ads by Harry Reid, Mark Begich, their super PAC. Why? Because they fear me, because they know I can beat Mark Begich in the fall and possibly make sure Harry Reid is no longer the Senate Majority Leader, right? Personal attack ads, okay? Who is the candidate in this forum who mimics and pretends to use Mark Begich's and Harry Reid's attack ads? You. It's not Joe Miller. There's letters to the editor in the Fairbanks Daily News-Miner, Treadwell campaign going out and talking about how Dan Sullivan never served in the Marine Corps. Marines hearing that from your campaign.
Thank you,
Okay,
sir.
so let's not cry crocodile tears over. What I was trying to do was setting the record straight with regard to your background on this issue. And
thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Thank you. We're just well over the time limit here. Mr. Treadwell, you get 60 seconds to.
Well, I never heard when he caught his first fish in Alaska. I do know that your first fishing license here was 2009. I do believe, Dan, that the question of your residency here is an issue in this campaign, and I believe it's a fair issue. And the mayonnaise quote was simply, down in my cabin, we've got a jar of mayonnaise in the fridge that's been here longer than you've been practicing in Alaska recently. And it is an issue that will come up in the general election campaign. My point is this. I've said we're going to be tough and we're going to be honest with Alaskans. And the mailers we send out aren't pasting people's faces on other people's bodies. The mailers that we sent out have brought up real issues like what you did, what you've done here. And as an outdoorsman, I guess I want to say this. The lifestyle that we have in Alaska, we like to fish, we like to hunt, we like access to our lands. And representing Alaska means you need to know Alaska. I've worked very hard on these major issues with the federal government for some time, and that's why I'm very proud that the Alaska Outdoor Council gave me the Sidney Huntington Award this year for helping to protect our hunting and fishing rights and our access rights. And Dan, some of those issues that came before us were issues that you had not dealt with well at the Natural Resources Department.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Mr. Miller, you get a question now from Mr. Treadwell.
Me and I was trying to figure out whether I was going to do the funny one or the serious one, but you already talked about mayonnaise, so I'll go to the serious one.
Gotcha.
There's a lot of confusion amongst Alaskan voters about where you stand on the issues because you've changed so frequently. In fact, I think it was Casey Reynolds who said, give Meade Treadwell 10 minutes, he'll change his position. We've heard different rhetoric and different action on climate change from you, the Law of the Sea Treaty, even taxes. You've signed the ATR tax pledge, as have I, and yet you have historically signed on to the United Nations Law of the Sea Treaty, which you've described as an international tax, and even the production tax with the World Wildlife Fund. Amnesty, you claim you're against it, but you say you're for a pathway to citizenship. I guess the questions that Alaskans want answered are, are all these just election year rhetoric, or are you seriously changed? Are you now the real conservative?
Well, Dan, I'll say to Dan, I'll say to Joe, and I'll say to the Alaskan people, I am a conservative who's worked on conservative causes all of my life. On the issue of Law of the Sea, when I first came to Alaska, there were thousands of foreign fishing boats taking our fish. Law of the Sea, a change in the Law of the Sea was necessary to get the 200-mile limit. Other nations in the Arctic are claiming areas in the Arctic Ocean. We can get areas 2 times the size of California, and I pushed for the mapping on that, the scientific work that's been done on that. On the issue of freedom of navigation, on the issue of protecting against oil spills, that's important. I believe that you need to start to understand what Alaska has in that treaty, and then let's work together to make sure that we're not sending taxes abroad. Make sure that we're working together to protect American sovereignty. And I have said very clearly, we will not have a vote for Law of the Sea until we solve those issues. But Alaska does have a stake in that. You've asked a bunch of other questions, but I'll answer just, I've got time now just for one. On taxes, we collect a small amount per barrel of oil produced here to have a fund to clean up oil spills. The federal government ran out of money on its fund. I helped get that tax back, and do you know how I did it? I did it by working with conservatives who are anti-tax, World Wildlife Fund, the oil industry, and along came the Gulf spill, and we had money to respond. So, Joe, get your facts straight.
Okay, Mr. Treadwell, thank you very much. We only have a few seconds left for this last question. Last question.
Well, actually, I get my rebuttal.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Joe, I'm so
sorry about
my
that.
apologies. I'm very sorry.
But I think we need to, and I thought about jumping in, but in the effort to make this more efficient on time when you made your disgusting comment. What I think, Mr. Treadwell, is that it's outrageous that one would choose to take a pathway to opening up the Arctic by subverting American sovereignty to the United Nations. The United Nations is one of the most corrupt organizations in the world. I mean, you even said that their imposition of the Law of the Sea Treaty is an international tax. They're collecting that tax, they're taking it to Jamaica. It's being allocated from Jamaica. The United Nations, through the Law of the Sea Treaty, is already acting as a super EPA. We've seen that with a factory in England. The fact is that it forces technology transfers from wealthy countries to less wealthy countries. This is a treaty that there may be things in it that can help Alaska, but the fact is we are the most powerful nation on earth. We can conduct ourselves with bilateral treaties, as we've done for hundreds of years, and achieve the same thing without giving up sovereignty of the United States. And I think it's disgusting, to be quite honest, that anyone would say, because of money, we're going to give up sovereignty to the United Nations.
Mr. Miller, thank you. And again, my apologies for jumping ahead of you there, sir. We only have a few seconds to answer this last question of the debate. Unfortunately, there'll be a winner next Tuesday. There'll unfortunately also be 2 losers. Should you lose in the primary election, will you support the winner of the Republican primary in the general election race? Mr. Treadwell, 10 seconds, if you can answer that in 10 seconds. Will you support the winner?
Yes, and if it's not me, I can see several things I need to help them on.
Okay. Mr. Miller?
Going to do everything we can to see that Mark Begich is defeated, and without a doubt, I believe I'm going to be the primary winner with the voters and God's help. But if it's one of you 2 guys, I've never said this before, I'll support you guys. I will. We've got to get rid of Begich. There's no question about it.
Okay, we've broke some news here. Mr. Sullivan?
Absolutely. I will support either Meade or Joe. I intend for them to be supporting me come Tuesday, but I'll support.
All right. We'll take a break, and we'll be back with closing comments right after this. Guys, thanks.